All right, thanks for tuning in to another edition of the OFN Meeting Room as we talk Buffalo Bills football. And we're going to do that with Ryan Talbot, who covers the Buffalo Bills for NewYorkUpstate.com. And it's good to have you on again, Ryan.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Well, it's a perfect time too, because there's the dead time in a lot of sports fans' lives, no question about it. And anything that they can dig their teeth into, to especially football. The draft is over, but still there's time for us to, and usually we'd be talking about rookie mini camps and OTAs and all that kind of stuff. But what do you do as far as a replacement, since you know there's so many other things that you could be doing right now if you had all the access to the players and going out to camp and things of that nature? So how do you fill that instead?
That's a great question. We're just very lucky that in general football is a year-round sport, even though we're not really getting to see the rookie, mini camps and things like that. We're still hearing about it. There's still topics for us to write about. So you're right. It's a little bit different right now, but we're very lucky that football seems to be that one sport where there's enough to talk about year-round, even in these unique circumstances.
Okay, well, let's dive right into the draft. Bills had 7 picks. They did not get the first rounder because of the Diggs trade, and we talked about that when we previewed the Bills draft. So I'm sure Buffalo Bills fans are pretty happy about not having a first-round draft pick. But I got to tell you, I looked at this draft, and I say this usually a handful of times if I talk about all 32 teams. But what I mean by that is there's usually a handful of teams drafts that I really like. Sometimes it's less than a handful. And I really like this particular draft with the players that they drafted that we're going to go over here, starting with A.J. Epinesa. I really like, especially with the fact that when you have no first-round draft pick and you still end up with a player that, I don't know, I mean, it felt like just a few weeks before the draft, A.J. Epinesa could have been a top 15 or top 20 pick.
Yeah, it's funny going back to January when the season first ended in college football. He was viewed as a top 10, top 15 pick in this draft. And one of my first mock drafts, I actually had Epinesa as the pick for the Bills at 22.
Okay.
And some people scoffed at the idea, and they said, "There's no way he falls to 22," and things like that. And now, fast forward a few months, and I know mock drafts aren't the be all end all because players do rise and fall in those ensuing months, but the Bills kind of sit there in round 2 and have him fall directly into their laps. This guy that even a day before the actual draft was still getting mocked in most first round drafts late in round 1. So maybe he wasn't that top 10, top 15 guy anymore, but most mock drafts and most draft experts still had him as a first round pick, no worse than an early second round pick. So, he falls right to Buffalo. He really fits what they like in a defensive end in terms of the size, the wingspan, the weight. There's this number, that 270, 280 range for the weight, a certain height, certain wingspan that Sean McDermott likes, that Eric Washington, their new defensive line coach, likes. And he checks all those boxes. So to get him at number 54 was just, I thought, was outstanding value for Buffalo.
Yeah, and because he brings a certain versatility as well, he can line up in a lot of different areas. Do you envision a specific spot that the Bills might value him the most?
Yeah, I think one, you're going to see him mostly at left defensive end, probably behind Mario Addison. But they've also said, Brendan Bean has said that on obvious passing situations, you could kick Epinesa inside and line him up next to Ed Oliver. So you'd have Addison, you would then have Epinesa, Ed Oliver, and Jerry Hughes as your defensive lineman. And that's a pretty scary group of 4 guys that are an offensive line to go against. So,
Yes.
there are a lot of possibilities for the Bills in terms of using him. But that's the beauty of it, too, is they don't have to rush him along in terms of getting him out on the field for 70 or 80% of the snaps, because you do have Mario Addison, you do have Jerry Hughes. Whether or not Trent Murphy makes his team is yet to be seen, but you have a guy like Trent Murphy, Quentin Jefferson, someone that you can also kick inside, outside, where you're not going to have to force him out there for a long time, but you can kind of ease him into the lineup.
When I followed Epinesa's career being a Michigan fan and a Rutgers fan in the Big Ten, and and I remember them talking about him. Like I remember watching an Iowa, it was a spring game when he was a freshman, and they talked him up about, oh, this is going to be the next big thing here. And, but he always seemed to be like a year late. Like he didn't explode the way everybody thought he would. But then the next year he would, the stats came out, and then his stats. So he always seemed like maybe a year behind. But what was interesting, and Arledge kind of wrote about it and touched up on it, was he doesn't. It's not like he does a lot of eye-popping things that make you just go, "Wow!" Look, like these unbelievable highlight reel plays. But he does so many things that you don't see. The average person just can't see unless they're zeroing in on him on every play.
Yeah, I agree with that. And after they drafted him, some people were like, "Well, they just replaced Shaq Lawson with another Shaq Lawson type of player," and I actually kind of disagree with that because Lawson, one area where he was kind of weak was in terms of his technique, and I think that's where AJ Epineza is actually really strong. He's not that guy that he's going to impress you with his speed or his burst necessarily, but he's a guy that's really good with his technique, and he can beat offensive linemen in that regard. In the last bowl game here before he came out into the draft, he went up against a first round offensive tackle that's actually drafted within the division, and he beat him, I believe, for 3 sacks in that game. So here's a guy that took an offensive lineman that went in round one, kind
Yeah.
of took him to the cleaners in that bowl game. So he has that. He's not going to wow you with the burst. He's not going to ever win a 40-yard dash, but you don't need that from your defensive ends. He's solid in terms of the run, stopping the run, and he has the pass rush arsenal in terms of his technique to kind of win as well in terms of those one-on-one
Yeah,
battles.
one of the couple of excerpts I took out from the Arledge profile. He's powerfully built, mechanically sound, uses his long arms and heavy hands to stand up a blocker and control the engagement. Also, keep in mind he had 8 forced fumbles and 7 pass deflections the last 2 years. That's pretty impressive for a defensive lineman. All right.
No.
Now the third round pick was again, in my opinion, a very exciting pick for the Bills, for Bills fans to and these running backs you get. This happens every year with these running backs, not necessarily first round talents, but how many times do we see running backs get drafted in the middle rounds or later, or sometimes not even drafted, and they have really long careers? And if he can stay healthy, Zach Moss has got all the ability in the world to be a big time running back for the Buffalo Bills. I like the fact now, especially where you have the rookie from last year. Now you've got a rookie this year. You put those two guys together, and you're set at running back for several years now, unless one of them decides you can't afford them. So I think that's a great luxury to have for the next few years for Bills fans.
Oh, without a doubt. And Moss I had at the top of my second tier. In the first tier you had Swift, you had Taylor, Edwards, Hilaire, you had Dobbins. But then after that, I had Zach Moss as the next best guy. And a few backs, at least one that I can think of, and AJ Dillon went before him. But I had Moss ahead of him as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think Moss is a great complement to Devin Singletary. First and foremost, is that he can be that one cut downhill back that you're looking for. As a rookie, they might ease him along kind of like they did with Singletary last year. Maybe you bring him in on short distance situations, you bring him in at the goal line, and then you give him maybe a handful of additional carries as well. And then you kind of increase his workload as the season wears on. But I really like that match that they have with Singletary,
Yep.
where Singletary, he doesn't have that burning speed either, but he's elusive. He can make you miss. I actually said after he was drafted, that Singletary can make you miss in a phone booth, but Zach Moss can kind of run through that.
That's right.
So
yeah.
It's an interesting compliment. Like you said, having a 1-2 punch that's this young for the foreseeable future, that's nothing but a good thing for the Bills.
And he also has soft hands, so he's going to be valuable in the passing game too. So yeah, again, like I said, it's just all about staying healthy for Zach Moss. And look, I look, the running backs that came out this year, the top backs that you mentioned, good players. I don't think any of them were. There wasn't an Zeke Elliott, a top 5 pick, but a Zach Moss. It wouldn't. I mean, I wouldn't even think twice if 4 or 5 years down the road, Zach Moss turned out to be the best running back in this class, and I actually had to think whether or not he was the top-rated running back coming out because he's got the talent to be. So I think this is one of those deals where maybe you benefited because of his injury issues in college. He just has to make sure that that's behind him.
Yeah, in this year's draft class, I think there's going to be a handful of players like that where in a normal given year, teams could do medical rechecks. They could bring those players in for top 30 visits and they could evaluate them there as well. So I think some players were hurt by it and that their draft stock fell a little bit. And I really think that he's that case where in a typical year, he wouldn't have been there in round 3. So the Bills kind of benefited from the fact that teams maybe couldn't bring him out and get a close look at him and do medicals on him themselves.
Okay, now the fourth round draft pick. You also, by the way, well, first of all, the fourth round draft pick was Gabriel Davis, the receiver from Central Florida. Also, the Bills also used up their sixth round draft pick, the second, for Isaiah Hodgins from Oregon State. And I'm the type of big time college football fan. I love all college football, even the late games, even following the late Pac-12 games. So I know what the Bills have here in Hodgins. It's interesting because you have the vertical threat in Davis, and you got the possession type guy in Hodgins. So they're kind of different in where they're going to be able to help the Bills at, but that's kind of what you want when you're trying to add a couple of more receivers to the mix.
Yeah, I actually think they're kind of direct threats for Robert Foster and Duke Williams, respectively.
Yep.
Davis being a threat for Foster, and then Hodgins being a threat for Duke Williams. And the one thing that both players have, though, is good size. Davis between 6'2", 6'3", Hodgins at 6'4". But you're right; they bring different things to the game. Where I think Hodgins could end up being a really interesting guy to put in the slot, a big slot option for the Bills. Right now, they have Cole Beasley there as a slot option, obviously a much different type of slot receiver, but I really like the thought of Hodgins in the slot. Great hands, a really promising player in that regard. He could probably win you win some one-on-one matchups out of the slot earlier than maybe he could as an outside type of possession receiver.
Sure.
And then Davis, he's that vertical threat like you mentioned. And in an offense where you already have Stephon Diggs and John Brown and Cole Beasley, you could insert him as wide receiver number 4. And he, again, expectations aren't going to be through the roof for this guy in year 1. If you can just kind of beat your guy deep, that could open things up for Josh Allen. And Allen absolutely has to work on his deep ball. That was one area where he was kind of disappointing last year, but there's no doubt that that's one of his major focal points this offseason. He is still being able to train with Jordan Palmer and Sam Darnold and, the same group of guys that he usually does in the offseason. I'm sure that's what he's working on. And maybe you won't see Davis put up a lot of receptions this year, but it wouldn't be a shock if his receptions went for big gains on whenever he does make those plays in 2020. So I'm interested by both players. I think that they both can be potential fits in this offense.
And now, when you take a look at young kids that come from the South, especially Florida or warm weather climates, is there, whether or not you've done the actual stats or whether it's just, from covering this team as long as I have, I've just got this memory that tells me that this is more of a risk, or not really. I don't think it matters. If the kid's talented, the kid's talented. So do you notice whether or not that when you get these warm weather, especially if it's a receiver, like a skill position player outside of tackler, somebody that is, and I'm talking more about finesse type players that have to deal with the cold and they have to be tough. You got to be a little bit more mentally tough to deal with cold weather and so forth. And maybe you just don't have that experience because you come from a warm weather climate your entire life. Have you noticed that at all being a problem with kids over the years?
I personally haven't. It'd be actually pretty interesting to look into that to see if there is a correlation there. Truth be told, I think the only position where it could really affect someone would be with that next pick at quarterback that the Bills had.
Yeah.
Just because of the swirling winds, the conditions that you might see later on in the season. But at the same time, skipping ahead a little bit, I think Jake Fromm's arm's a little bit better than some people say. Obviously, he's not the Josh Allen type, but few are. But I still think he can make most NFL throws, if not all NFL throws. He does have to kind of maybe work on improving that velocity a little bit here as a rookie when he comes in. But that's something that you could end up working on, strengthening your arm a little bit. He's obviously not going to be pressured to come out here, but and play much. But in terms of wide receivers, no, I don't know if I've seen that correlation personally.
Okay.
Running back, Zach Moss, going back to him, he says he knew Devin Singletary from their time at Florida, but he went out and he played at Utah, and
Oh
Utah had
yeah.
some colder weather there, and he fared pretty well in that regard.
And
So
Hodgins too. That's
yeah,
why maybe
that's
Hodgins might have a little bit of an advantage over Davis. I don't know.
yeah, exactly. Definitely something to monitor though, and look at going forward.
All right, yeah. Speaking of From, and if anybody, I mean, I'm sure they've heard me talk about it repeatedly, heading up to the draft towards the end of last season, and then right after the draft. I mean, Jake Fromm was like one of my sleeper guys of the entire draft because I understand why he wasn't a top player. Should he have lasted to the fifth round? Should he have had lasted past some of the other quarterbacks that went ahead of him? No, I don't think he should have. I think that there's too much of the of what you see at the combine, or there's too much of the arm strength, too much of sort of like here's a perfect example, and that's Eason and Fromm. And I know you can't. I know I'm not trying to say that because one kid's better than the other kid in college means he's going to be better than the pros, but it kind of proves my point with this. It works for me when I can compare these two kids because Fromm beat the kid out, and it didn't matter that Eason was bigger and stronger and had a bigger arm. Fromm beat him out, and he was just better, and he was going to be our guy. And that's what Fromm brings to the table. And, whether or not you want to call him a winner or whatever, you can't underestimate the fact that this kid played in so many big games since he was a freshman. All you have to do is turn the tape on in any of those big games, and he didn't look like it was too much for him. Now, did he go out and win the game for Georgia? No, but he put Georgia in position in all of those big games to win those big games. It wasn't his fault that Georgia's defense couldn't stop Alabama in a couple of those games. If the defense stops him, we're talking about a kid that could have 2 championship rings in 3 years.
Yeah, without a doubt. And again, just like Zach Moss, I think Fromm is another one of those players that fell because teams didn't get to bring him in and meet with him. I think they would have probably been blown away with the personality, with the smarts, with the intelligence. I think that in terms of charting out plays, explaining things, he would have really wowed some teams. And I think that's going to, again, benefit the Bills early on here. He's not going to be playing anytime soon.
Yep.
I think that even if something happened to Josh Allen, you're still going to have Barkley on this roster. I think they're going to have to carry 3 guys in 2020. So, again, there's not going to be any pressure for him to play, but where he can help immediately is in the quarterback room in terms of what he sees and what he does. And a guy like Josh Allen can still benefit from that, even though Josh Allen's entering his 3rd NFL season. So there's things like that where, if you think down the road, that can help Josh Allen too. And then long term for Buffalo, he could end up being their number 2 quarterback. I just don't think that with this shortened off season, whatever it's going to end up looking like,
yeah.
you can go and say this guy's going to be our number 2 QB. You still want to have that veteran presence back there. So on the field, you're not going to see much from him, but I think that he can really help this team in that quarterback room and from a leadership standpoint.
And you brought up the good point of when you were just talking about Fromm and the conditions, even though he does have better arm strength than maybe people are projecting. But the fact is, it is interesting that Allen's your quarterback. It made so much sense because of his strong arm, because of the conditions in Buffalo. But then here you got a guy that's like almost a complete opposite. Usually when you get these quarterbacks, sort of like all you got to do is take a look like at the Baltimore Ravens and who their backup quarterbacks are. It's usually the backup quarterbacks are so it's a seamless transition that they have some sort of some sort of similar skill sets to the starting quarterback. But that's not the case here.
No, not at all. And I would say it's not the case even with their current backup in Barkley. They just, for whatever reason, the Bills must feel, or Brian Dable must feel, that you don't have to have the same exact traits as Allen to be able to be successful in his system, which, we've seen some people be pretty successful in his system when he was obviously in New England, when he was at Alabama. So maybe there isn't a prototypical size, speed, arm strength type deal, dual threat type of player, because Allen can obviously win with his legs as well. But you're right. Some teams they kind of say this guy fits the mold. Let's go with that. Other teams kind of say, it can kind of be a scatter in terms of what that player brings versus what we currently have.
All right, let's go with round 6 and the other pick, which is Tyler Bass. So again, we could talk about conditions and things of that nature, but Bass is a strong leg. He didn't have production-wise the type of final season that he would have liked, but apparently, he did pretty well at the Senior Bowl, and I'm sure that helped.
Yeah, I think that's probably where the Bills first really got a good glimpse at him. And I know some people that were at the practices throughout the week, and they said, yeah, this guy was just making 60-yard kicks look easy. He was just driving the ball, and there was a special noise when his foot connected with the ball. I'm sure the Bills people there in attendance heard that as well, and they thought, there was a point last season where I'm not saying they were going to cut Stephen Hauschka, but they tried to put in a waiver claim on Chase McLaughlin, a player that they actually had in camp last season, and then ultimately they didn't have a spot for him on the roster, and he did play for a few different teams last year, and he was ultimately claimed elsewhere. But there was that time where the Bills tried to put in a claim for him late in the season where Hauschka was struggling, and to Hauschka's credit, he bounced back after that failed rosters claim, and he was pretty accurate down the stretch in the regular season. He was on the money in the playoffs. In that game against the Texans, but it doesn't hurt to bring in a big leg kicker this offseason to see what you have. Now, the problem is if you're going to carry 3 quarterbacks this year, are you going to really be able to carry 2 kickers as well? I would probably say no, and I'm not sure that you could sneak Tyler Bass onto your practice squad. I think he was the number 1 kicker on a lot of teams' boards. They just didn't necessarily have the need for him at that time. But between now and the start of the 2020 season, whenever that is, teams are going to go through their own issues with their kickers.
Yeah.
And they might say, listen, what we have now is not good enough. We've seen this guy miss in practice. We've seen him miss in the preseason. I'd rather put in a claim on this rookie that was number 1 on our board and see if we can develop him. So the Bills are going to find themselves in a tricky situation, I think, when it comes to this, because either you're going to give the job to Bass in a pretty important season for the Bills where a lot of people are expecting them to win the division, or you're going to risk losing him by not having him on your 53-man roster. So I'm really intrigued by this move because I think that when all is said and done, he's going to win the kicker job.
Okay.
But if he doesn't win it, what do they do? Do they really try to cut a player at another spot to keep him on board? Do they try to sneak him on the practice squad, which I don't envision happening? Well, so that's something that I look forward to seeing what happens long term.
Yeah, because I guess you'd have to think that if he has a real good preseason or just an overall good camp, and like you said, that all right, well, that's why they draft him, so he gets the job. If maybe they're just a little unsure, that's where it does get tricky. But what you probably get is like what happened with Minnesota last year, which is okay. They may want to keep the veteran kicker. They like the young kicker, so let's trade the young kicker. And if he makes the team, which is what happened with the Jets, if he makes the team or if he lasts throughout the season, whatever the case may be, then the Bills get a draft pick, something like that. So at least they get the compensation back. But I mean, because Hauschka, you would think that if Hauschka gets freed from Buffalo, he'll be on the street for about 5 seconds. He's not that old.
Yeah. No, he's not, but he is starting to struggle with longer kicks. So, yeah, if you're comfortable with having a guy that's going to be pretty accurate from 45 in, absolutely. Maybe even 48, 49 in, but those 50-yard kicks aren't necessarily his strong suit anymore. And, to go back to the young player argument, it wasn't that long ago. It was obviously a different regime, but where the Bills had Dustin Hopkins, and they ended up parting ways with Hopkins. I believe he was actually dealing with injuries at the time when they brought him into the team, and they ended up going, I think it was Dan Carpenter at that time. But Hopkins has actually established himself pretty well. He's been a pretty reliable guy for Washington. So, you don't want to see a deja vu of that situation where you bring in a young guy, he has the talent, and you part ways with him too soon. where then you're in the same boat where you're replacing a guy like Carpenter down the road in free agency with a player like Hauschka, and then having to repeat this process. So it's going to be interesting, but I think that if all things are equal and Bass is showing that he
Yep.
can make those longer kicks, they might kind of be willing to go through some growing pains during his rookie season, especially when you have the offense that you have now. You shouldn't be dependent on your kicker
Yes.
to win you games where you have such a
Yep.
strong offense on paper now. Truth be told, this is the year that you should be saying, if we're not winning games, that's on Allen in this offense. That's on Dable or whoever. It's not on the
Yes.
kicker. You shouldn't be waiting last minute for
And
Tyler
that's
Bass to
exactly
win you the
my
games.
point on the Jet show when they lost Myers to Seattle. He made so many big kicks for him the year before because they needed him, because they couldn't finish drives and score touchdowns. They had to rely on the field goal kicker for 3 points and 3 points. And so my point was exactly your point, was that, well, they're supposed to be better, so they shouldn't need him as much. Seattle's more desperate for a kicker because they've had so many kicking problems for so many years. They're willing to give the guy anything he wants. But you're in that situation, especially when you're not a playoff team like the Jets were last year. We should just take a chance. I mean, just go ahead. He wants to go and spend your money elsewhere. And I could see the same thing happening with Buffalo in this situation. I guess the last question is: is he still adequate with the kicking game, as far as kickoffs? And if not, is that then going to be a possibility as well, where they might keep both kickers and have Bass be the kickoff man?
That's a scenario that some people have mentioned, but it's actually going to come down probably to the punter job for that scenario to pan out, because in addition to Bajorquez, the Bills brought in Vedvik, and
Oh,
Vedvik,
okay.
has been a kicker, but he's going to exclusively be a punter for the Bills. So if he does win the job, though, and they're still comfortable with Hauschka, I think Vedvik would handle the kickoffs,
Interesting.
because Hauschka he actually let quite a few last year falls short of the end zone. And I don't think it was necessarily planned. I think the Bills are trying to kick it to the end zone to let the team start out at the 25. I just didn't think he had the leg strength consistently to do that. So it's going to be interesting, because with a guy like Vedvik, if he wins the punter job, which I think he is in it's in the realm of doing, because Bajorquez was inconsistent. He could obviously handle kickoffs too, but if Bass wins the job, that's another area where you could benefit from his
Okay.
big legs. So the whole competition this offseason is going to be interesting
Okay.
to watch.
And as far as the final players to mention, seventh round draft pick Dane Jackson for Pittsburgh, 3-year starter, a good player on a good defense. So not bad for a seventh round pick. And Trey Adams is, to me, the most intriguing free agent pickup rookie, because in his sophomore season, here's a kid, first team Pac 12, All America, left tackle prospect, was going to be a cinch top 10 pick when he was going to come out, then has the back injury, and that's been holding him back ever since. That doesn't mean that all of a sudden he gets now in with an NFL program, conditioning program, that he can build up his strength in his back, and all of a sudden you have yourself a talented kid that you didn't have to use a draft pick on. So he's very intriguing, considering you didn't have to use up a draft pick for him.
Yeah, first touching upon Jackson. Jackson had 39 pass breakups in his career at Pitt. That's pretty
Yep.
impressive. He didn't necessarily come away with a lot of interceptions, and maybe that hurt him in the long run. I think the Bills have a lot of talent in their secondary, so it might be hard for him to land on the 53-man roster. He might be a guy you could sneak onto your practice squad. But I do like him. I think that ultimately you could get value out of him on the inside. Taron Johnson's a guy that's been very good for the Bills. But he's also been banged up quite a bit in his career, where, maybe it's just he goes off on the sidelines for a series or two. Then other times it's been for games and shoulder injuries and things like that. So there might be a chance for Jackson to carve up a spot here as a rookie. In terms of the undrafted free agents, yeah, Trey Adams is definitely the most intriguing, especially in terms of name value. Because I think a lot of people, like you said, they saw him as a surefire first, second round pick after that sophomore season where he looked great, but then he had that history of injuries. And the one thing I can say about the Bills is that they've been one of the healthier teams in the league the last few seasons, and especially last year, maybe the healthiest team in the NFL. And they invested a lot of money into their facilities, in terms of what they can do for players throughout the week, and getting them healthy, getting them ready to play in games. And that could benefit a Trey Adams, and that could end up benefiting
Hmm.
Buffalo long term. Another name I'm going to throw out there is Reggie Gilliam, fullback that they ended up getting out of
Okay.
Toledo. I think Patrick DeMarco, the writing could be on the wall there for DeMarco too, where DeMarco, the one thing he really brings, aside from the locker room leadership, is special teams play. And the Bills went out and they added a Tyler Matakevich in free agency. They re-signed, well, they didn't re-sign. They lost him for a year, but they brought back a Taiwan Jones, two guys that you can really shore up your special teams unit with. And then you have Reggie Gilliam, who had 6 block kicks in his career at
Wow.
Toledo. So he has that special teams talent. And then he was also kind of listed as a tight end slash fullback on a lot of draft reports, where, yeah, he didn't record a lot of receptions in his career at Toledo, but he has good hands and he had really impressive speed. I want to say he ran a 4.8 40. For a guy that's 240, 250 in that range, that's an impressive 40 time. So I could see his athleticism winning him that fullback job for Buffalo, because truth be told, they don't run DeMarco out there much on offense. If he is out there, a lot of the times it might be on a QB sneak or a short yard situation. And then it seemed like he'd line up outside as a wide receiver once or twice here and there and catch a ball. Well, I think Gilliam could actually do better in that role, where DeMarco, he'd catch the ball and he wouldn't really go anywhere with it,
Right.
just because he doesn't, have that speed. He doesn't have that yard after catch ability. So Gilliam's another player I'd say keep an eye on for
Okay.
this summer, if we do get to a training camp, to see what he can do in terms of maybe winning a spot out and then saving the Bills about $1 million in cap space if they are able to let Patrick DeMarco
And
go.
before we let you go, Ryan, what was the fan base reaction to the draft? Of course, understanding that part of the draft was the trade for Diggs. So overall, again, I really liked it, as I said at the outset. So were the Bills fans happy with their draft?
Yeah, I think they absolutely were. I mean, I think they realized that the draft itself, there weren't any flashy moves, but they were players that addressed needs. They were also players that you could honestly say were probably the best player available at that point in time in the draft. And the flashy pick is the trade for
Yep.
Stephon Diggs. So you address needs. You added a number one wide receiver this offseason with your number one pick. Brendan Bean was correct in saying I don't think one of those top 3 guys is going to be there at number 22, which sure enough, lo and behold, all 3 guys were off the board before that. And I think that Bills fans would obviously say that they would take Stephon Diggs 100 times out of 100 over a Justin Jefferson, who went number 22 to the Vikings. And that's no knock on Jefferson. It's just that rookie wide receivers generally don't come in
Yeah.
immediately and contribute, where in a year where the AFC East is wide open, that Diggs is going to be able to step
Yep.
in and contribute immediately for the
Yeah, if this
Bills.
was the year that they drafted Allen, that's different. Okay, draft Allen,
Mhm.
draft Jefferson, build a rapport together. But yeah, Allen at this stage of his development, boy, does he need a true number one dynamic option at receiver that's going to help him out. And this is the perfect time to make that deal. So made a lot of sense. I think, look, the Bills, the program in general, the way that they're building their roster, the staff, everything looks like it's pointing up. Things haven't gone well for them for many years, since the Jim Kelly days, it seems. Little here and there, but for the most part. But I think the Bills fans, they got to know that this is a time that is sure looking like it could be another really good 5 to 10 years, especially now that Tom Brady's gone.
Yeah, without a doubt. As long as Josh Allen takes another step, because he made some major strides. I thought from year 1 to year 2. If he takes another step this year with the defense that they already have, with the upgrades they made on special teams, with the upgrades they made on the offense, then this team could be pretty special in the AFC for the foreseeable future and be right there contending with the Ravens and the Chiefs of the world in the AFC on a year-to-year
Yeah,
basis.
now the pressure is going to be, how are they going to deal with the pressure of, because we haven't, we'll talk about it when we preview training camp and the 2020 season, but that 90% of the people are going to pick the Bills to win the division. I know that. I'm not saying I'm even going to do that. I have no idea. I probably will, but I just know it. I do. You'll have some people who would just try to be smart. Oh, Belichick and so forth. But I just the general consensus, people are going to, the analysts will take the Bills to win this division.
Yeah, they've flown under the radar in 2 of the last 3 years when they made the playoffs. I'll be the first to say that. 2017, actually, I think a lot of people saw that as a rebuilding year. The Bills trade Watkins, they trade Ronald Darby right before the start of the season. People thought that team wasn't probably going to do much, and they sneak into the playoffs. Then you kind of tear it down to rebuild to get your cap healthy again. So 2018, there are no expectations. You have a rookie QB that you take in round 1. You're not going to probably see him unless injuries occur, which did, and then there was ineffective play at the quarterback position. But then, 2019, same thing. Everyone said Tom Brady, Patriots, they're going to win the division, and they did, obviously. But there weren't necessarily expectations for the Bills to even grab one of those wild card spots, and they did. They win 10 games. Probably would have won 11 if they had anything to play for in Week 17 against the Jets. And now the expectations are raised. You are being expected to win the division, expected to
Yep.
win possibly double-digit games despite having a much tougher schedule on paper. So you're right. How they react will be very interesting.
Ryan, great job as always. Appreciate it. Can't wait to talk to you the next time because more than likely that means we'll be previewing training camp, and I can't wait for that to happen.
Yeah, you and me both.